Humour, that quality of being amusing or comic, especially as expressed in literature or speech, a dimension of behaviour we take as a given to be cardinal to our humanity. Indeed, to explain the nature of laughter and tears is to account for the condition of human life, as William Hazlitt puts it in On Wit and Humour. One's manipulation or taste in the craft of humour can be the subject of judgment, in the same way there are aesthetic judgments of art and tastes in music that we may praise or berate. Hence, dullness is considered a social vice, as even the Stoic philosopher Seneca says, "Bear yourself with wit, lest you be regarded as sour or despised as dull." Conversely, one can take humour too far, or be shunned for impotence with its craft. Attempts at humour may even reveal a narcissistic desire for self-actualization, if not outright derailing a social event already. As some turn to humour to gratify others selflessly, others make jokes so they themselves feel rewarded by laughter. We've all seen the sort to make a joke and then giggle as people laugh at their joke, the telltale euphoric outburst at receiving the desired social back-channeling. This has its evolutionary roots in sexual selection and courtship. To be funny is to demonstrate guile with mental objects, the bricolage for a rational animal, a marker of intellectual competence to be signaled for social clout. This was first espoused by Jan van Hoof and then expanded upon by many evolutionary psychologists. Much else has been made on the more constructed role of the comedian in human societies, the wider utility of the archetypal trickster and fool who inverts order into chaos, the trusted Shakespearean court jester to King Lear's ear. So be it through the primordial or cultured levels of analysis, humour's place has been rationalized and regarded as part of the furniture of human essentials, and this was after much historical admonishment of humour from theologians and philosophers. Plato famously objected to unbridled laughter, assessing it to be an undignifying emotion that overrides rational thoughts. If anyone represents men of worth as overpowered by laughter, we must not accept it, much less if gods, he says in the Republic. In Plato's outline of a perfect city or state, the Callipolis, he goes as far as to say that comedy will be censored there, as there will be no use diminishing self-control in a state that already runs like clockwork. No composer of comedy, iambic, or lyric verse shall be permitted to hold any citizen up to laughter by word or gesture, with passion or otherwise. Likewise, early Christianity concurred with this negative view of humour, as the Bible seemed to link laughter purely with hostility. The one time where God is shown to laugh in the Bible is with malevolence. The Lord who sits enthroned in heaven laughs them to scorn. Then he rebukes them in anger, he threatens them in his wrath. Mockery is even seen as such an offence that it may deserve death, as seen in the mauling of a group of children in 2 Kings 2:23, for they're laughing at a prophet's baldness. Despite having outgrown these monastic orders once, in our more contemporary times, the confines of both interpersonal humour and the narrative genre of comedy are being challenged yet again. Sentiments closer to Plato's and this archaically religious compulsion towards perceived moral purity are popping up. These discussions on who gets to make certain jokes, and whether the fool still warrants a seat at the court of the public sphere, often dissolve into the deeper issue of free speech. Whilst I think the loss of free speech is a slightly overblown argument by all these public provocateurs and those assessing that you can't make certain jokes anymore, there certainly seems to be a widespread censorial attitude brewing towards humour. I think this tilt towards purity and inertia has led to a general decline in comprehension of what humour actually entails and whether words truly hurt people. A crucial cognitive muscle is atrophying from how we're teaching people to think about humour nowadays. At the smallest units, jokes are fundamentally posits on reality. Even if the content consists of a falsehood, the involuntary reaction to falsehoods reveal internal inclinings, and we're as shit scared as ever to posit claims on reality or to be exposed to the world. The state of comedy as a narrative genre today is a reflection of this, as is the prevalence for meta-ironic humour styles in young people. Funny as that may be in itself at times, admittedly, it still reflects an overall fear of positing ontological claims and fails to account for the breadth of what humour can achieve. These days, comedy as a narrative genre is in steep numerical decline in cinema. Pure comedies are made less, they're seen as a risk. When they are made, they don't do as well. Where comedy is still invoked in the media landscape, they abide by the dominant trends. These dominant trends include standpoint theory, dictating who gets to make what jokes, compelled working against the oppressive intersectional ladder, also known as punching up, and what is known as verticality in feminist narrative theory. The development of these trends may stem from a common parlance appropriation of critical theory, disseminated from higher academia into increasingly sloganized platitudes. It could also equally be speaking to a collective Cartesian malaise in the market, an audience themselves becoming cautious of categorical claims. Either way, what results is we're all getting dumber, less funny, and more socially inept, at a time when perhaps we need to have a sense of humor as much as ever. Humor has undeniable ties with intelligence and mental health that we mustn't neglect any longer. And before we can ponder on these ties and make the case for it again, we should sketch out the existing discussions on how humor has been understood. Today I'll briefly outline the major theories of humor throughout history, trace how humor became frowned upon again in this current landscape laden with critical theory principles, how these principles aren't actually helping the social causes they claim to aid, how this is making us dumb and socially incompetent, and lastly, how we can stop being dumb. So let's begin with the major theories of humor throughout history. Thinkers throughout history have attempted to pinpoint humor's fundamental makeup, its root equation, or to put it more plainly, what makes something funny. The first of the three major theories of humor is the superiority theory of humor. This builds upon Plato's assessment that the pleasure of humor is derived from a distasteful feeling of superiority over others, typically attributed to Thomas Hobbes' writing in Leviathan in 1651. This is the laughter associated with that of a bully, the schadenfreude at witnessing a third party stumble. It is a humor style associated with narcissistic personality disorder, the kind of humor you see in the gung-ho, stick-your-chest-out American braggadocio types, i.e. the habitual and low-hanging plugging into the modes of self-aggrandizement you see in Tony Stark. This may only be funny for the few who hold the upper hand, he who makes the jokes, or their sycophantic disciples. A good example of this is with the people who wave a loaded gun in your face and find humor in you getting shit scared.
I want a kebab.
What? Really?
No. Why? Were you going to go and get me one?
No.
Whilst this theory seems perfectly applicable here, it doesn't account for times when your superiority to someone leads to no amusement, or when amusement arises from something besides superiority. Think of the equally easy bottom-barrel sex jokes or potty humor. There isn't a subject of scorn here, and yet people find such things funny. The relief theory of humor, then, is devised as a possible explanation for why we find such jokes funny, sketched out initially by Lord Shaftesbury in his 1709 essay, An Essay on the Freedom of Wit and Humor, where laughter is explained as a release of pent-up animal spirits in the nerves. Herbert Spencer, and most famously Sigmund Freud, would later build upon this from a psychobiological level of analysis. Humor here is assessed as a release of nervous energy, such as the superfluous energy needed to calculate a task, or energy used to repress emotions like the sexual or the hostile. I'm simplifying and aggregating from these thinkers, but that is what is typically meant by relief theory nowadays. Relief theory is typically seen as the least satisfactory of the three explanations. Studies about joke preferences by Hans-Jürgen Eysenck have shown that many people who enjoy aggressive and sexual humor the most are not those who usually repress hostile and sexual feelings, but those who express them healthily. Though it seems perfectly feasible to say that this does actually fit the bill for many people, who certainly display such feelings onto their jokes, whether knowingly or not. So I don't think this is completely inapplicable, and using things like dark humor as a means of confronting sensitive topics in a non-threatening way, you could say is relief in itself, a preventative measure against the shadow self becoming unintegrated in Jungian terms. This also speaks to those contemporary, not like the other girls' utterances about masking trauma with comedy. Nevertheless, we then have the incongruity theory of humor, considered to be the most penetrating of the three, to account for the sizable remainder of jokes that don't involve a sense of superiority or pent-up psychic energy. Incongruity theory submits that it is the perception of something incongruous that makes something funny, something that violates our mental patterns and expectations. This is an idea taken up by the likes of James Beattie and Immanuel Kant notably, but was hinted at by Cicero, who says in On the Orator that the most common kind of joke is that in which we expect one thing and another is said. Here our own disappointed expectation makes us laugh. Here laughter arises from awareness of the sudden contradiction between what we expect to happen and what actually happens, mismatches between our preceding concepts and reality, demanding a cognitive shift to bridge the gap. This is where shock humor comes in. Family Guy is a show known for pushing this binary structure to its limits with its cutaway format, admonished as lazy by many for allowing itself to jankily jump to whatever abstract scenario that it wishes, for the sake of shallow but penetrating laughter. This was parodied even by fellow adult cartoon South Park. Incongruity is thus typically agreed to be the most comprehensive theory of the three. These theories have been built upon by others. A germane integration of all three is found in Tom McGowan's theory of lack and excess. In psychoanalytic style, McGowan submits that, as desiring beings ridden with lack, we always seek something else to fill the lack, and are bound by excessive attachments. Since we as subjective beings are deemed to feel this lack perpetually, our attachments have to not just be appropriately sufficient, but overflowingly excessive, to fill a void that can never truly be satisfied. Those who seek something the most, then, desire its excess. This is the idea that you could be so hungry you'd eat a horse, or when those who are sexually deprived think they could sleep around an exceeding amount. There are realms in life where lack is appropriate, say the dressing up in formal attire at an office, and realms where excess is appropriate, say acting sociably at a house party. Never the twain shall meet. Comedy is where these norms are inverted deliberately and incongruously, providing catharsis for the longing for excess in a realm of lack. Look to the quippy comedic characters who are just steps ahead of everyone else, here relieving the subject in an interplay of the relief and incongruity theories. In some cases, we see the inverse, where subjects are disenfranchised from excess and placed into situations of lack, a character stumbling, falling short.
Good Lord, that's remarkable. And completely wrong.
Like with Condide's globe-trotting journey, where his blind faith in Leibnizian Christian cosmology is constantly found wanting against a coldly impartial and unforgiving reality. This exposing of lack is prevalent in socially conservative satires and comedies, and that's conservative in the literal sense, meaning that there's an implied wrong way of being morally that's being criticized. You see this often in the Eat the Rich satires, where a scapegoat is expropriated for a cathartic invective. This provides the subject with a sense of validated moral superiority in an interplay of superiority and incongruity theories. So as you can see, comedy has provided an outlet for one of many bardic desires in media and narrative. Thus the comedian's role is also underscored as having a special quality compared to other participants in society, that they should be given rein to play out the aforementioned archetypal roles of fool or trickster between the margins. So no person or concept remains sacrosanct. Their impartial and undiscriminating casting of moral judgments enforces norms where conservatism is needed, or violates established norms where progressivism is desired. Disregarding the free speech absolutist types for a moment, arguments defending comedy and comedians today from censure typically cite this classical function. These are the dominant ideas on what makes something funny and why the role of the comedian has utility. Evidently, this notion of utility has been brought into disrepute lately, and much of the admonishments stem from what I like to call the fear of deposit, a symptom of the postmodern condition happening both at the top-down level from the academic intelligentsia and bottom-up from the mass public. In the 1950s and 60s, there was a collective epistemological despondency from various high postmodernist thinkers. Two dreadful world wars challenged the linear narrative that human beings were making veritable progress as a species. Thus, narrative was now a disputed meta-concept. What resulted was a widespread Cartesian pitfall, where all moral claims are now treated with skepticism and distrust. The overall enterprise in academia was to determine how everything we believed to be true had been constructed, often arbitrarily. There were an infinite number of ways the world could be interpreted, so it was considered anachronistic naivete to assume any narrative posits or truth claims deserved canonity over another. They were mere leaps of faith. Noam Chomsky famously described the postmodernist Michel Foucault as, quote, completely amoral, in his hesitance in positing any ontological claims, at least without presuppositions on the constructed dubiousness of such claims. These deconstructionist frameworks would arise in a myriad of disciplines at roughly the same time. New criticism and reader response studies sprouted out of literary criticism, where texts were now divorcing from authorial intention. In artificial intelligence studies, the frame problem emerged. This refers to the infinite number of ways an AI was able to interpret its environment, and therefore it is debilitating it from knowing how to act in the world. Foucault would assert that any claim or interpretation of reality was predicated on attaining power, whether purposefully or not.
This was concurred by others, notably Roland Barthes in his seminal essay The Death of the Author,
where authorial intent was now entirely divorced and deemed to merely reposit the wider cultural and social condition. For instance, with the historical ubiquity of the hero myth, where psychological development is necessitated by voluntary acceptance of suffering, it is deemed a mere patriarchal artifact and one that excludes the feminine. It acts as an apologetic convenience for capitalism by advocating for workaholism, repressing your feelings stoically and plugging into the oppressive system and therefore reinforcing it. Post-structuralists believe that the pre-existing cultural imperialism of hegemonic groups leads to the very nature of language becoming oppressive. There's the prevalence for masculine forms of words being the norm, male defaultism in policeman or Latino, or the positive connotations the dominant binary carries. Un passeggiatore, for lover of walking in Italian, means exactly what it says on the tin, whereas its female variant, una passeggiatrice, carries a sexualized connotation, commonly used to refer to a prostitute who solicits men in public areas. Thus, the postmodern juncture would then become more actionable in the form of critical theory and deconstruction. Whilst it was felt that such markers of identity, such as race or gender, are constructed, they are reified as though they're legitimate and given presumed hierarchical rankings in the real world. Those who take part in the struggle help to reproduce the game by helping, more or less completely, said Pierre Bourdieu. Even by using the words taught to us in school,
we're reproducing the hierarchy.
Thus, the full scope of human concepts had to be scanned and deconstructed for the sake of equality. This broad tilt towards deconstruction includes our linguistic devices, aesthetic tropes in the visual arts, and even the narrative structure of stories human beings have been told historically. In linguistics, we change the words we use, incorporating gender-inclusive phraseology. We queer the category by reclaiming slurs for once targeted groups. In art, we busy ourselves with the petulantly iconoclastic, reify the belief in the stupidity of belief in representation through representing little to nothing. What little we summon, we do so to shatter oppressive standards for taste and beauty, by drawing attention upon the deliberately ugly and shocking. In narrative, we move on from prehistoric storytelling, over-empowering the subjectivist gaze of the marginalized, like that of Fun Home by Bechdel, the mise-en-scène privileging scattered feeling over action, where once the hero stoically pushes past trial and discomfort to a greater end,
the world now comes to the anti-hero through self-actualization or
dismissal of the call to maturity entirely, selfishness preferred to selflessness, eros over agape, or where once the narrative voices typically autodiegetic and focalized to one, usually overrepresented stand-in, narration is now made non-linear and exchanges various hats and voices, such as Marjane Satrapi's Embroideries or Mark Z. Danielewski's House of Leaves. Across the arts and culture, this widespread deconstruction is easily seen. Some of these changes are objectively good, but some of these attempts at queering end up hurting the cause more than anything, because they presume an essentialist correlation between, say, being good at art and advocating for Eurocentrism, speaking well with being white. A lot of minority groups end up being patronized further by these trends. There are non-hegemonic groups that the hero mythology speaks to. We still need to appeal to a unitary self, even if the world is oppressive.
You can't not show up to work and not feed yourself,
just because capitalism isn't meritorious or that the world is deemed oppressive. The fact that people can gesticulate like this and retain inertia usually signals that they're pompously privileged rather than oppressed. This fractionated movement has had an unavoidable impact impact on comedy as well, with its germ, humor, becoming a battleground concept. Comedy at its very root definition becomes highly charged. All aforementioned theories of humor share a binary structure, and since critical theorists deem that we fundamentally privilege one binary over another, this is what Derridians call logocentrism typically, whether we can or should even do comedy anymore gets called into question. It's never just a joke anymore, even if you're not aware. Thinkers like Judith Butler and Frantz Fanon discuss the pervasiveness of what's broadly called othering. We identify ourselves through comparison to others. It's an assumed fact that we're built to be prejudicial. Pseudoscientific literature is conjured up all the time to demonstrate the inherent darkness of our nature. The dubiously devised implicit associations test, aimed to prove our baseline white centrism. The journal articles that were on track to being published without rigorous fact-checking or regulation by those behind the grievance studies affair, demonstrating the narrow Overton window of academia. We must then get the jump on the all-powerful instinct to other people, thus the advocacy for being actively anti-racist rather than merely disagreeing with racism tacitly as once was the norm. Some forms of comedy confront this fundamental marginalization of one binary compared to another, even in the most primal forms of humor, like the pun, as even that implies a right use of language as constructed. Thus, in extreme cases, contemporary comedy speaks to a deeper queering of the nature of comedic language, or even language in general, such as in Hannah Gatsby's inverted use of words.
Make of that what you will. Thank you and hello.
Or the blurring of comedy with other mediums, like in Bo Burnham's multimodal performances. But outside of those more fringe examples, mainstream comedy has largely been influenced by the sentiment that we cannot help but speak through oppressive hierarchies. This is confronted by strict adherence to standpoint epistemology, originating from Sandra Harding and feminist theory. It is often invoked to say that those belonging to an in-group shall be the only ones who can joke or create comedy about that group, whilst those who reside further up the intersectional ladder will be subject to open season assault for all, due to their historic privilege. Comedians, in spite of their once purported utility, are now accused of punching down rather than up. That those who suffer the mockery of what's supposed to be equally dispersed and impartial actually end up bearing an unequal amount due to the fundamental imbalances in our language and culture of oppression. It may be that the groups deemed subjugated, being mocked in any manner, would be closer to bullying, as they're already subjugated, so it is in society's appropriate interest to be purely obsequious to the marginalized. This is why the dominant exception to the declining genre of comedy in mainstream cinema has been the endless recycling of eat the rich satires, what Bong Joon-ho calls the upstairs downstairs movie, and somewhat class the eat the rich movies as more satires than as comedies built for laughs purely. But besides these questions of representation, feminists have accused the traditional bardic structure of comedy as appealing to the masculine in the same way beauty and art is said to appeal to the European.
An update to comedy is then required.
This goes deeper than merely comedy by women for women, but applies a structural principle the feminist theorists call verticality. Whereas comedy and narrative of the past operates on a linear structure, jokes moving from one context or subject to the next in chronological motion, verticality operates on repetitive motion, circling around one subject. This arose to prominence in internet sketch comedies like Amy Schumer's Inside Amy Schumer, where a Barthian myth as simple as women lacking the ability to take a compliment is repeated in a loop until an exit gag that fails to reach any sort of solution. This is the hallmark of the feminist sketch style. Feminist screenwriter and researcher Stacey Taylor states that sketch comedy is a form that accommodates failures to reach tidy resolutions. It is moral instruction without an abstractable call to action, and you see the sketch style seeping into comedies and other genres in general, even when the genre or length of a feature film isn't optimally built for this style. With old-school online sketch shows like Smosh or College Humour, the usage of what Stacey Taylor and the feminists call a singular organizing principle being used to generate as many laughs as possible was seen as a strong suit in the bite-sized length of videos and also the expanded range of viewership being catered to. This format of comedy may have been partially necessitated by the landing zone of the internet early on, where shorter form content and lack of separation between high and low art reigned supreme. And while else we may now watch Humour's Barnum statements and cringe at the presupposition that we don't already think racism or sexism are bad.
Besides, you're white ladies. You're fine.
Wow. Racist piece of...
Thanks, Dave.
The argument made for such platitudes then was that it allowed people without an expensive liberal arts education to feel involved with important social matters. New York Senator Kirsten Gillibrand said, "It's the ripple effect. Amy Schumer can reach a whole class of young men and women who can now understand the issues better now that she's delivered it so effectively with humor." Sarah Ahmed isn't wrong to say that laughter is the first form of protest. The early days of the internet may have allowed for previously unmobilized groups to connect on their problems being spoken about for the first time in low art, and the mere acknowledgement of things like racism and sexism was maybe novel enough to warrant a laugh back then. However, it's been a long way since Inside Amy Schumer first came out. To still operate on this humor style on political issues no less is merely reinforcing the struggle without adding to the discourse. Most people already believe sexism and racism are bad things. The jokes you hear on Inside Amy Schumer, where the entire premise is to signal that we believe these things to be bad things still, as if to make sure everyone's on the same page, are infantilizingly patronizing. Which is why I believe when her show made a comeback after the landscape of the internet had advanced, it was not as successful. It was seen as way too on the nose, and accused of talking down to the audience. These kind of Barthian myths are reified so often that you may say that the need for things like racism or sexism outstrips its supply. It offers more narrative affirmation for those who want these myths reified to justify their realities than it does genuine laughs as a comedic style. It echoes a line from Ernst Gombrich on the modern art movement's attention to social causes and activism turning into mere rhetoric, ritualistic prompts. The unexpected prestige acquired by an art of defiance when it became the badge of progress has turned the first tragedy into the second. The professional iconoclast who has run out of his favorite icons is a sad sight. Since Albert Besnard has ceased to matter, the Trebla Dranseb has lost its point. Feminist verticality similarly leads to impotently swinging at windmills, akin to being struck by St. George in retirement syndrome, where once St. George received accolades for slaying the dragon, he falls in love with the adoration and starts killing every animal that moves, eventually resigned to swinging at nothing and ravingly declaring each swing to be another dragon slayed. That's why critical theorists began obsessing over microaggressions and language the moment equal rights were passed. Institutions also bank off the reifications of such issues, even when there are none. Recently, the CEO of the LGBT paper Pink News effectively owned up to using fear-mongering headlines on trans issues for profit and then stopped when it ceased being profitable. That's not to say that things like minority issues don't matter, but there's clearly a corporate interest to set the agenda that the world is racist or sexist and can only be thought of as that. So much more happens in the world besides that, and when you normalize it as a comedic style, it makes for beating of dead horses, where once comedies felt rich with gags that only lasted so many iterations, or skits that felt unique to themselves in isolation, you now get repetitive gags that exhaust the nostalgia circuit, fit for YouTube compilations. Look to the can opener joke in Suits. This was fucking hilarious when it popped up the first time, for its jolting out of nowhere randomness.
On three. 1, 2.
Wait, let's go in your office.
I'll get the can opener.
I suppose the writers saw that this was effective, because they would reuse it over
Don't think I didn't see that can opener.
and over
Why don't you tell Donna I want her to have this?
and over.
I'm gonna get the can opener.
Stop trying to make fetch happen. It's not going to happen.
Mythologizing it endlessly, which, paradoxically, destroys the mythic quality that made it funny in the first place. This is coded into the style of the sketch as intellectualized by feminist scholars. The premise of a sketch is not the starting point. It is the whole point. The sketch is not a structure so much as a singular organizing principle from which one can bail once the comic possibilities are exhausted. It is perhaps vertical as opposed to linear. In improvisation terms, the goal is not to advance, but to extend. Writing within the form of a sketch might encourage us to hammer a point over and over. So if you feel jokes now get hammered home over and over again, this is a partial reason why. Even if you do find it funny, surely you understand that comedy can be a varied genre that goes further than that. I'm not saying that all of these writers read feminist theory. I think a lot of feminist comedies, like Schumer's work, wasn't that deeply thought through, and was merely intellectualized by scholars after the fact. However, this speaks to to an overall fear of the posit that emerged in both high and low culture. These days it's just another realm of the media space that gesticulates without positing anything constructive at the end. Those slogans on intersectionality, punching up, or standpoint are all relayed on the internet and cultural discussions in lower resolution forms as a means for non-academics to justify their positions on everything from politics to movie reviews to certainly what's considered a crass joke or not. Objects move out of intellectual circles and into common parlance all the time. The idea of the Freudian slip has become a naturalized reference to being betrayed by what you really meant when you misspeak. The Japanese population self-diagnosed with depression far less when commercials didn't use the term depression to describe general sadness. Gaslighting, grave dressing, narcissism, and OCD are psychological terms that people just casually toss around now, as it helps them put their finger on something previously more difficult to describe. And you'd have to be blind to not see this happen with the critical academic theories.
The scholar Catherine Hales writes about this very real occurrence in her book Orderly Disorder in Contemporary Literature and Science, which investigates how parallels between literature and critical theory emerge at the same time, forecasting chaos theory as a discipline.
I can imagine that many outside of academia may not have read standpoint theory from the source, but have its essence baked into their mindset via the endless streams of faux deep pseudo-philosophical TikToks, unsighted Instagram infographics, and second-hand opinions from political pundits. We're all struck by the postmodern condition, especially young people. The internet and multiculturalizing social environments have flattened what constitutes right or wrong. The growing fear of the posit in the youth can be seen in Gen Z's humor styles falling under the meta-irony category, out of the four sketched out by the YouTuber and political satirist J-Reg. This is where one's humor style is all on the tone of the statement, sounding ironic, rather than there being a meaningful remark buried underneath like with post-irony or irony. Again, I'm not at all wanting to bash the youth here. I think it takes an intelligent awareness of the globalizing McLuhan village we live in to even come to this attitude. It's also very funny at times, but it can't be the be-all and end-all. Humor can do so much besides that. We have to posit how we see the world in order to know what to do with it to make it better. I remember my screenwriting professor Eric Shaw, who wrote for SpongeBob and Word Girl, showing a class full of young people the trailer for the film Analyze This, a fairly tame meat and potatoes comedy from 1999, where a grief-stricken mafia boss seeks the assistance of a psychiatrist. The professor looked dumbfounded that it barely got a laugh out of a classroom full of awkward Gen Zers. Granted, I didn't think it was that funny either, nor did the In a World trailer narration help. But the film plays entirely on differences in binary oppositions. The violent mafioso is an Italian Catholic, whilst the psychiatrist is a Jewish stick in the mud. I remember Shaw having to break down why the scene at the Catholic church was supposed to be funny, i.e. the incongruent action from the Jewish man entering a Catholic church and doing something off-kilter with the holy water. The essence of the entire media artifact was shot through a lens of difference. It was clear to me that this made people uncomfortable because they were taught these days to think nobody was different to one another and tabula rasa, clean slates by TikTok. The idea that there may be differences between groups on its own makes people uncomfortable, it seems. But differences are not a bad thing in itself if you believed in true diversity.
And we also have to see how these groups are behaving in order to know how to be respectful of their differences.
Think to Julian's mother being slapped in the face by the mother of a black child she tried giving a penny to as a kind gesture. In Flannery O'Connor's short story, Everything That Rises Must Converge, completely unaware that the newly integrated black people would feel that way about what would have been a charitable gesture in another scenario. There seems to be an outright aversion to looking at things like statistics, under the sense that merely reifying the right myths and slogans would socially construct a cosmopolitan landscape into existence. If equalizing things is deemed to be necessary, or that such differences are even a problem, we need to be able to talk about things first before we know what to discard. Things like the gender equality paradox, lack of fathers in black families, the tendency for racial abuse hurled towards Asians being from black people, etc. Merely drawing attention to that does not manifest it into existence repetitively. They are descriptive statements rather than prescriptive. Many people can't tell the difference, just like a lot of them can't tell that a categorical joke isn't stating that people fit into those categories forever and always. Michael Phillips writes in his paper Racist Acts and Racist Humour in 1984 that much of the popular Polish jokes of the time that use the aesthetic of racism do not involve actual hostility towards Polish people who had long assimilated into North American society. He uses this following joke as an example. The Polish astronaut calls a press conference to announce that he was going to fly a rocket to the sun. When asked how he would deal with the sun's intense heat, he said, "Don't worry, I'll go at night." To enjoy this joke, it is not necessary to have racist beliefs or attitudes towards Poles, any more than it is necessary to believe that Poland has a space program. This is a fantasy enjoyed for its clever depiction of unbelievable stupidity. Sometimes the joke is funny precisely because it is implicit that we think the context is fallacious or that the bad thing is bad. Like dead baby jokes, dark humor is funny precisely because the aesthetic is offensive. And a shocking amount of people are ill-equipped to understand the context here. They operate on Voldemort he who mustn't be named logic, whereby merely mentioning the bad thing equates to the bad thing being invoked. Like joking about dead babies somehow means that it's a good thing. Connor Kiampor coined the phrase comic immoralism, which is the belief that immoral elements in humor enhance funniness, that because something is wrong and we're able to recognize that it's wrong, the incongruity is further widened and thus the joke is funnier. Like how removing the Polish element of the joke makes it less funny. Its enjoyment is not necessarily due to agreement in the thing that is wrong. Our finding it funny could be precisely because we have a shared understanding that the content of the joke is totally wrong, so it actually speaks to an implicit respect towards one another and guile with boundaries, and a context such as a joke makes it fine to laugh together on. This is shown in studies demonstrating ties between enjoyment of dark humor with intelligence. You see this in how most working class cultures actually receive such jokes in grace and humor. It is usually the bourgeois university student types who take the most offense, so I think it's just on those who don't find humor in such jokes to just get with it if they can't clue in. Humor has to be opened up for people to think, and thinking that jokes being made at someone's expense is somehow genuinely harmful to them speaks to a widespread misunderstanding of what humor is. The way this fear of positing is medicated is through sterilizing the power dynamics and ensuring that only the desired straw man is attacked when we make categorical claims, punching up the intersectional ladder. It's not just unconducive to critical thinking, but it's hard to determine who exactly resides up or down unless you use newly prejudicial frameworks and erect essentialist barriers yet again, that which led us down this path in the first place. It doesn't account for the times when grievances shift, and when they do, you can't say that you've operated without stooping to a low to justify the new victim's vitriolic response. What you typically end up with is people who are not victims of slavery demanding reparations in the form of permanent obsequiousness from people who never owned slaves. And this idea that the ends justify the means, that you resolve racism or sexism with more of the same, is sadly what's advocated for in most colleges. There's this student film that I saw the other day called Piece of Cake, where the moral spectrum of characters from good to evil fits perfectly into the desired grooves. White man, bad. Brown man, better. White girl, even better. And black girl, best. Oh, and the white girl gets their arm broken off and thus becomes disabled, therefore being raised up the moral ranking, I guess. I was astounded to see such unabashed narrative affirmation. It was all right to a T. So punching up doesn't work. It fails to account for the genuine non-essentialist diversity of people in the world and doesn't account for grievances shifting. Standpoint theory also doesn't work because human beings have empathy and can relate to one another, certainly if we communicate our queries effectively, which the sterilizing principle does not encourage. It's stupidly backwards a mindset, especially considering our multiculturalizing environments that demand more persistent communication than ever. This idea that only a member of an in-group can make certain jokes is totally dubious. Retired football players often make shit football coaches and pundits. Good with the feet doesn't equate to good with the brains. Out-group members make huge contributions to discourse regarding in-group members all the time, sometimes precisely because they stand from farther away. One of the greatest second-wave feminist novels, Stepford Wives, was by a man. These principles lodge comedy purely onto politics and makes it more propaganda than art. Precisely what Plato advocated for in his hypothetical totalitarian government he devised. We're not free to think like we were, and thus we've become dumb and can't even recognize harmless humor when we see it. I'm not saying that everyone who launches into the most grotesquely insensitive remarks are somehow smarter than others by default, or that you should be gung-ho about talking out of your group identity. Context obviously still matters, and the aesthetic of an offensive joke can still be gamed incompetently. But to not even allow room for someone else to make a joke on you is ridiculously brittle. People should be allowed the leeway to develop their intelligence without false pretense of words being violent looming so large. Jonathan Haidt has spoke extensively on how our culture teaches people to become more fragile, learning helplessness with the adopting of what is effectively an inverted form of cognitive behavioral therapy. Instead of attempts at perceiving stimuli or stressors as positively as possible and acting in the world, we tell children that words hurt them and that they're justified in allowing their emotions to take over and derail their bodily functions. Where once human beings were measured as tool-making animals, tools becoming a part of us, with neural pathways growing into phantom limbs like the wings of planes that we'd fly above the clouds, we now can't even master our own bodies. We cannot master our minds without being allowed to think, lest believing that words hurt us to this extent. We've grown so far inward, the problem of the great other being resolved through sanitizing what can be said is really a devil's bargain. Hegel spoke of the triadic structure being necessary for growth, that an individual has to meet other individuals to truly know what they are, thesis to meet antithesis so there can be synthesis. What we're witnessing is a freezing at the thesis stage, merely demonizing the great other and appealing to the desires of the Nietzschean slave endlessly
is both a psychological weakness and a narcissistic reflex, one that relies upon a superiority theory of humor on moral grounds against the great other, always the victim and savior, never the perpetrator.
It's the same thing you see with the one annoying guy at the horror movie showing, giggling through it all to show that they're not afraid. But best believe the slavish are afraid. The world is a simpler place if you can paint the other side as evil. You become good without much work as a result, but it's a false dawn for growth. There's ample proof that reductionist remarks about the constructed opposition ends up hurting the supposed moral cause they claim to speak for more than anything. If indeed the point of comedy now is subservient to social cause and taken more as moral invective rather than entertainment. The sociologist Stanley Cohen wrote in Folk Devils and Moral Panics back in 1972 that exaggerated covering of supposedly deviant behavior in the days of mods, rockers, and punks ended up amplifying deviant behaviors in those groups and made them more seductive to young people, who end up joining those groups as an act of semiotic resistance to mainstream ideology. Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables line lost her crucial voters. The Democratic Party somehow made the same mistake again 8 years later. The endless amounts of guilt-tripping satires and what counts as comedy now can't have helped. The widespread obsession with the looking-glass self runs analogously to these issues.
Identities were once seen as functioning in accordance with their environment are now seen as self-identified and for the environment to adjust to.
The oversight on humor is a reflection of this fear of judgment from the environment. Nobody wants to be on the wrong end of superiority theory. Nobody wants to be laughed at. We must make it so that we do the laughing and judging in comedy. We make it so nobody laughs interpersonally, unless it's on how nothing is being said. Henri Bergson, in his Laughter, an essay on the meaning of the comic, spoke about laughter as a means of correcting faulty behavior in others. That humor is a sign of intellect precisely because it demands the stoppage of your heart temporarily. That you must cease your sympathies for a moment to mock someone into better behavior. So humor isn't just a demonstration of intelligence, but bravery. It's in allowing judgment, even within oneself, without daring to speak, positing aspects of yourself that may not stand tomorrow, possibly getting laughed at by the herd. You can't find out who you are. You can't test your ideas. Ethologists have drawn parallels between human uses of humor with play activities that help develop the brain. Lions play by going through actions that will be part of hunting. Humans have hunted with rocks and spears for tens of thousands of years, and so boys often play by throwing projectiles at targets. But as thinking creatures, our thoughts and mental processes become play objects too. Mark Spinka observes that in playing, young animals move in exaggerated ways. Young monkeys don't just leap from branch to branch, but from trees into rivers. Children not only run, but skip and do cartwheels. Spinka suggests that, in play, young animals are testing the limits of their speed, balance, and coordination. In doing so, they learn to cope with unexpected situations, such as being chased by a new kind of predator. We as human beings have to play with our thoughts and learn to take error with more grace in order to grow.
Taking taking offense is a part of life.
The play activities that seem most fun are those in which we exercise our abilities in unusual and extreme ways in a safe setting. Sports is an example, so is humour. The more extreme it is, the more our brains develop. In other mammals, play usually takes the form of mock aggression, such as chasing, wrestling, biting, and tickling. According to many ethologists, mock aggression was the earliest form of play, and all other play developed from it, according to Owen Aldis and Jaak Panksepp's research. This means it makes perfect sense that human use of humour shouldn't just be extreme, but that we should allow them to be extreme on immoral grounds. In mock aggressive play, it is critical that all participants are aware that the activity is not real aggression. Without a way to distinguish between being chased or bitten playfully and being attacked in earnest, an animal might respond with deadly force. In lower animals, they are unable to differentiate between mock and real aggression, as their mental processing is too tied to the present experience. So when people feel offended, they are tapping into a primordial circuit that has motivated adaptive behavior such as fighting, fleeing, avoiding noxious substances, withdrawing from activity, and avoiding similar situations in the future.
But we're not in danger now.
We're merely teaching people to fear more. We're orienting them towards this lower form of mental processing and stunting their growth. Connor Kiampor's comic Immoralism maps onto this mock aggression play through harmless play with the aesthetically wrong and offensive. Of course, there are those who laugh precisely because they are in agreement with the thing that is wrong, in which case the solution isn't to stop everybody else from enjoying offensive jokes and stopping people from thinking, but to laugh at people who are clearly in the wrong. We can teach people that it just isn't the worst thing in the world to be on the end of a joke. We're animals built to survive far worse. It's not aggressive physical assault. That's the real utilitarian cost of living in a free speech society. For you to have access to your best self, others have access to their worst. The cost of losing our capacity to think is far worse on the other hand. As you look to the drop in IQ, rise in social ineptitude, and cluster B personality disorders, obsessing over controlling how other people view the looking glass self. I always think of the vision outlined by Star Trek, this futuristic utopia with no currency, the show of the first interracial kiss, and an abundance of different species and groups in harmony. They'd make jokes about the aliens' different features out of affection, and there would be no malice taken, because they're so far past those early group conflicts that it's now seen as a mere quirk that there are differences at all. As Christy Davies' studies have shown, these sorts of categorical jokes are found around the world, and that the ethnic group being stereotyped is not an enemy, but people quite similar to those telling the jokes, as in the case with Polish jokes earlier. It helps a group bond with another group. An editorial in the American Journal of Psychology said of humour that,
"Perhaps its greatest function is to detach us from a world of good and evil, of loss and gain, and to enable us to see it in proper perspective. It frees us from vanity on the one hand, and from pessimism on the other, by keeping us larger than we do, and greater than what can happen to us."
Another aspect that's crucial, perhaps most crucial, besides being allowed to laugh at others and allowing others to laugh at you, one must know how to laugh at oneself. This issue, I feel, is almost uniquely American. Kids in America are told to back themselves, fake it till you make it, outright lie on their CVs, and fall victim to the Peter Principle regularly, to reframe every oddity and idiosyncrasy as a superpower and irritate one another all round as a result. American films often focalize around main characters that are heroic self-inserts, American dream displacements, the Tony Stark figure to look up to, heroes that ostensibly get the girl when they don't really deserve her, just because the script says they should for a contrived happy ending. It's part of the cultural bardic release. That's why something as low resolution as Joker makes such a cultural impact, whilst in Europe it's the sort of thing that grows on trees. British media, on the other hand, has always encouraged introspection. Think to David Brent, who is effectively a character study of narcissism. He who seeks attention and being liked in all forms of desperation, unsuccessfully and eventually to his demise. That's the exact sort of behavior rewarded in the US. Oddball characters like iCarly's Gibby and even Brent's American equivalent Michael Scott are granted access to social success and an eventual happy ending. This is catering to effective disposition theory, so we end up fantasizing about a life well lived. Brent's ending is realistically triumphant. His narcissism makes him unpopular, he gets fired like someone behaving like that would in real life, but grows enough of a backbone to tell his bully to fuck off at the end. Because it's something that most people can actually foresee in themselves, it's arguably far more inspiring than Michael's unrealistic and undeserved happily ever after. Brent encourages us to look inward, to see the shadow within ourselves. It is what is called imaginative rather than fantastical in aesthetic discussions. By looking inward, we are thus drawn outward into the real world. Whilst Michael Scott is a fantasy that remains internal and does not work in accordance with the material reality, encouraging an entitlement that the world largely doesn't have the minerals to fulfill, thus requiring as much as a hobby horse or scapegoat to bash is even more apt for a feeble mind. Trump being a racist isn't the reason why your life isn't where you want it to be. It also isn't Churchill or Columbus's fault either. It's the same feeble instinct that compelled Spanish auto-da-fés, village lynchings, and that which Shirley Jackson reproached as a human defect in the lottery. It's part of an overall program for inertia and using the brain as little as possible. Besides an absence of Brentian characters, American sitcoms are laden with laugh tracks and non-diegetic music cues telling you what to think and when to laugh. It's nice junk food entertainment, but it can't be all you consume. Even the reality TV shows are like that. Look at the drama-infused Kitchen Nightmares in the US version.
Rule. That's why it's gone so well.
Versus the UK variant, which is just a show about cooking. Comedies worldwide are starting to appeal to the lowest common denominator styles to break into America. We have to demand more so that we don't forget how to think. In Germany, popcorn films have their designated name in Zeitunterhaltung or popcorn kino. Most films are more challenging by default. In the US, it is the art house film that gets its own name. Thinking is seen as the extraordinary feature rather than a necessary part of life. I think it's telling that the only recent American mainstream film with a morally grey main character that encourages recognizing the shadow within is Oppenheimer, directed by a Brit, so hopefully we see a new emergence of comedies that can inspire growth instead. And laughing at ourselves and knowing not to be offended are necessary first steps in correcting our own faulty behaviour. It is that which separates the laughter of the slavish herd and that of the golden laughter of the overman, who rises above the disorder of life through confronting it bravely. Americans cancel British comedians online all the time due to this inherent illiteracy and eagerness to take offence. Simeon Goldstraw's sentiment that if an audience is offended by a joke, it is a terrible thing. And yes, they are being harmed, but they are being harmed by themselves. We stunt our own growth by denying ourselves such a fundamental part of our being. We're not really laughing when we watch punch-up satires. We're made to agree and be lectured like with consuming edutainment. Use of irony and wit are associated with higher levels of education and verbal intelligence. Aristotle, who said in Nicomachean Ethics that life includes rest as well as activity, and in this is included leisure and amusement. Some people carry amusement to excess, vulgar buffoons, Aristotle calls them. But just as bad are those who can neither make a joke themselves nor put up with those who do, whom he calls boorish and unpolished. The landscape now in humour and comedy is both a result of and causing declining intelligence and social skills. In the late 20th century, Ted Cohen wrote about the social benefits of joke telling. In the American Psychological Association's Character, Strengths and Virtues Handbook, humour and playfulness is put down as a strength of transcendence. Engaging in humour can foster a tolerance for ambiguity and diversity, and promote creative problem solving. It can serve as a social lubricant, engendering trust and reducing conflict. Indeed, in this postmodern condition that strikes all in a multiculturalized and global village where community has faded and loneliness is felt as much as ever, the answer isn't to appeal further to an ineffable and frozen thesis. The answer isn't to dispel the other, but rather to open yourself up to the other, to show willingness and sensitivity to their judgment. And there's no better way to cut tension in these new and distressing social environments than with a joke. According to one estimate, we are 30 times more likely to laugh with other people than when we are alone. This is the eutrapelia the Greeks spoke of, the skill in using humour to make others smile. When in potentially stressful situations, we shift to the play mode of humour. Our heart rate, blood pressure, and muscle tension decrease, as do levels of epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol. Laughter also increases pain tolerance and boosts the activity of the immune system, which stress suppresses. Humour is that which is good for us, like the candle that lights an infinite amount of candles. That's what we should do with humour. At its best, a verbal and social jousting. It is what people want in close closer relationships, along the path of rediscovering the child. Thus the studies that show that happily married couples engage in nonsense humour more. It is that which we desire deep down, and not to be blown out in envy. Thomas Aquinas says, it is against reason for a man to be burdensome to others, by never showing himself agreeable to others, or being a killjoy or wet blanket on their enjoyment. Earlier we had mentioned how jokes ought to be driven by an understanding of the harmless nature of them first. We know implicitly walking into a comedy show that there will be jokes, and I say we should expect any environment to be ready for a joke as well, as is the comedy of life. Since we can't tell what is right or wrong in the final analysis, a good yardstick is to always try to be funny at least. That's why the great comedies and comedians stand the test of time. Candide's authority of choice to take aim at may largely have dissolved today, but it's still well worth reading for the humour nonetheless. This be funny credo is what's advocated for by Steve Gimble. A retort against this is that we can't know for sure what really is funny until we make the joke, but that's something we'll just have to be brave enough to push past. The amount of times a shit joke has opened up a room, broken the ice, cut the tension in half, and allowed everyone to loosen the shackles, it is there that we have the microcosm of culture, of discourse. That's what humour can do. We are in as dire a need for jokes than ever, so go out there and fucking make one.